Hello and good morning. I'm Doug Buehler, a Michigan State University AgBio Research Director and Assistant Vice President for Research and Innovation. Thank you for joining us as the MSU College of Agriculture and Natural Resources continues to celebrate Agriculture Month here in Michigan, as well as Women's History Month across the country. Today, I have the privilege of introducing two women scientists who are going to explore with all of you the issue of trust in science, especially as it relates to the global pandemic and some of the issues that we face today. Our keynote speaker is Dr. Cary Funk, Director of Science and Society Research at Pew Research Center. For 2 decades, Dr. Funk has specialized in public trust in science. Her work examines the social, ethical, and policy implications of scientific developments in climate, energy, genetic engineering, and food in general. Our moderator is our own Cheryl Kirschenbaum, who is the co-author of a book, Unscientific America, How Scientific Illiteracy Threatens Our Future. She's also the moderator of MSU AgBio Research Our Table Conversations on food issues as they relate to the environment, waste, social inequities, climate, and more. Cheryl and I also co-coordinate the MSU Food Literacy and Engagement Pool, which we have looked at this issue in a number of questions over the years. In our most recent poll, we again asked about who people trust in terms of scientists. The good news of that is that university and academic scientists were among the most trusted and higher trust level than our colleagues in government and industry, but that trust was still only about 60% of the population. So it's clear that we're doing well, but we need to do much better. And so with that, I think that's really part of the reasons that we're here today and have chosen this important topic. So with that, I'd like to welcome everyone and turn it over to Cheryl. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug, and welcome everyone to today's conversation, and especially welcome Cary. A few housekeeping notes. We will be using the question and answer tool today to address your questions. So if you have a question for Cary, please type it into the Q&A feature and hit send. That icon is located either at the top or the bottom of your screen, depending on what type of device you're using. If you have any technical difficulties throughout the webinar, we're putting the Distance Learning Help Desk phone number in the chat for you to refer to. So with that, and I'm sure you are looking forward to listening to Cary. So Cary, welcome.
I'm very happy to be here. I'm happy to be part of this event. Of course, I would rather be able to talk with you in person, but we will kind of use this as a starting ground for our conversation. We're going to be taking questions through online chat, and hopefully we will have opportunities for in-person conversation down the road. We're going to talk a lot about data today. We're going to go deep with our public opinion data, but I'll be focusing on those key takeaways. So you don't have to, memorize every percentage point. We'll be trying to pull that data as an example of something to take away. As we mentioned, what we do at the Pew Research Center is really a lot of public opinion work around the implications of science for society. We've been doing this for more than 5 years now. I'm going to draw from a number of different studies through this period. And we try to cover science, the whole of science, but really not the whole of science, because we're looking at the pieces of science that connect more broadly with civic issues, because they are either raising social or policy or ethical issues for society. So there's lots of kind of bench science that doesn't really get a lot of public notice. We're talking about those pieces that are in a broader discourse. The other piece of it that we really like to focus on is kind of emerging issues in science and technology, because as you know, science and tech are really key drivers of change in society. So that's one of the reasons why they do become part of public discourse, is they're bringing new changes to society, and how people make sense of those changes is really important. So we'll talk a lot about trust today, and then we'll also kind of look more specifically at how people make sense of emerging science and tech. We'll go ahead and start on trust. And here you don't have to zoom in on every little data point. You're going to get a zoom here in a second. But what I want you to see is that we are taking a look at people's levels of trust in scientists in comparison with other groups and institutions. And when you take it from this lens, what you're going to see is that public levels of trust in scientists are actually now fairly high compared to other groups. They're closely followed by trust in the military, and trust in scientists is much higher than many of these other groups, including K-12 school leaders, including religious leaders, and much, much higher than trust in journalists, business leaders, or elected officials. Now, we're going to talk a lot about what trust means, and one thing you should be asking is trust for what? Trust to do what? Trust in what way? So most of the time when we ask about trust in a public opinion survey, we're making a little more of a phrase, so we get that sense of what the trust is about. Here, the language is, how much confidence do you have in each of the following groups to act in the best interest of the public? So trust to act in the public interest. We put a lot of focus on the category that would be at the bottom of these charts, the share of people saying they have a great deal of confidence in each group. That gives us that kind of highest level of trust. You also see in a kind of lighter color that there's a fairly large share of the public who has what I would call a more soft trust. They have a fair amount of confidence. It's not really negative, but it's not that strong level of confidence. Okay, I think the only other point to make is that, as you may know, if you look down on the bottom part of this slide, trust in the media, trust in business leaders, and especially in elected officials is extremely low. You're seeing levels of just 4% in the most recent survey saying they have a great deal of confidence in elected officials to act in the best interest of the public. We've been living in an era that's really kind of marked by low levels of trust in government in particular, and that tends to be shared across the board. So let's focus now on trust in scientists. And what you're seeing here is the close-up, right? So actually what we did was we randomly assigned survey respondents to either give us their rating about trust in scientists or their rating in medical scientists. And there's a way in which that's kind of an internal replication for our thought about trust in scientists. And what you should be seeing is a similar pattern. We are, again, focused on this kind of darker color near the center line there, saying people who have a great deal of confidence in scientists to act in the best interest of the public. And what you should see there is a rise in confidence. So from 21% in 2016 up to 39% in November of 2020. Of course, one of the key questions around this data is what's happened since the coronavirus outbreak really took hold. And there we're going to focus on just these last 3 data points from January 2019, which would be before the outbreak, to more recently. And so you're seeing even that uptick over a short period of time. Yeah, good, that's all right. On the, what you see is the same pattern going on with medical scientists. So again, an uptick in people's confidence level in medical scientists to act in the best interest of the public. And we can go ahead and move forward. The big caveat to all this is that this uptick has not been uniform across all Americans. So here you're seeing just those 3 most recent data points by political party. Among Republicans, you see that trust was stable initially in April of 2020, and then it has even gone down a little bit since then, November 20. And then on the other side, they're supposed to be bluish bars to remind you of Democrats and independents who lean to the Democratic Party. And what you're seeing there is that increase in overall level of confidence in scientists has come primarily among Democrats, not Republicans. So as a result, what we're seeing actually most recently is now a wider political division around trust in scientists than ever since we started measuring this in 2016. We actually see the same pattern when we look just at those folks who rated their trust in medical scientists. And this is all, it's all noteworthy essentially because it's new, wider, particularly around medical scientists. It's not something we've seen in the past. That was an area where we typically saw a lot of bipartisan agreement. There has always been a kind of a more modest division between Democrats and Republicans around trust in scientists, but it's clearly wider now. All of that perhaps fits with a broader conversation that we've seen around the coronavirus pandemic. Certainly one of the, I'm not going to bring you a lot of that data today, but one of the hallmarks of public opinion has been the degree to which we're seeing political divides over everything connected with the pandemic. From particularly most striking is the degree to which people see the coronavirus outbreak as a threat to public health is widely different between Democrats and Republicans. And certainly that connects with views and opinions about pretty much everything connected with how you handle the outbreak, whether we need more restrictions, the place of masks and restrictions, all of those things. We're tending to see a pretty wide political division over those issues. As a new communication landscape for scientists, so to the extent this holds in the future, it suggests we might need to be thinking more carefully about how do we bridge political divides, because they're going to be more prominent, or assuming they are going to be more prominent in the conversation. So let's go ahead and go forward. This talk a lot about politics. It's not the only kind of differences we see in people's levels of trust. And one longstanding difference we've seen over time has to do with levels of trust in scientists by race and ethnicity. This is, again, kind of a lot of data to take in here. You're going to focus on those darker blue colors near the center line. And you can see there that relative to white Americans, on average, Black Americans tended to express kind of lower levels of confidence in scientists. And the same thing if you look at kind of the more negative rating of the share of people who had not too much or no confidence at all in scientists tends to be a bit larger among Black Americans. That actually picked up just a bit in that November 2020 survey, so we'll have to keep an eye on that, whether that holds. But it had been kind of a longer standing pattern. It also is seen from other data sources over time. Similarly, among Hispanic Americans, you tend to see a little lower levels of trust and confidence in scientists compared with white Americans. So this, we're not going to go into a lot of detail here, but I just want to make sure it's clear. There are lots of divisions in society. Not all Americans are thinking the same way. And so one thing we need to do as a scientific community is to think about where that's coming from and what we could do perhaps to bridge those differences. Now to go there, I want to just back up a little. Go ahead and move to our next slide, please. I want to back you up a little bit to some of the other ways we've approached measuring trust in scientists. And so we're going to go deep on trust today. And one of the things to keep in mind is what you just saw was really what I call our kind of overall measure of how much confidence or trust people have in scientists. You can also think about trust as a kind of multidimensional space. And one of your own at MSU, John Besley, is one of my colleagues doing this kind of work. Is also a fan of thinking about trust as having factors, dimensions. There's more to it than just overall trust. So this was a study we did in 2019 to try to unpack that. And again, one of the things we did was we thought about what trust really means. And one of the ways people talk about it a lot has to do with trust as an expectation, essentially for behavior from a group. In this case, we're talking about a group of scientists and a group in the public. At the personal level, it could be a one-to-one kind of sense of trust. So here we asked people to do a lot of different ratings about a lot of different kinds of scientists to try to understand better whether that word that we use, scientist, matters, whether when people are thinking about a particular kind of scientist, they think differently. And whether or not the nature of what the nature of that expectation varies. So there's a lot to unpack here. In terms of the groups that people rated, they either rated kind of practitioners, what I would call practitioners, or researchers. And then we tried to vary the domain across medical research, food-related research, and environmental research. What we have highlighted here is just the two food groups. So we've got dietitians representing a more applied practitioner-oriented group and nutrition researchers as a research-oriented group. I want to pay attention to the kind of rows in the middle. When you're seeing a slide like this, each row is generally a different question. So here you're just seeing the share of people who said that that in this case, 60% of Americans said that dietitians care about people's best interests all or most of the time. For comparison, 29% of Americans said that about nutrition research scientists. So you did see this kind of pattern where dietitians and medical doctors in particular tended to be rated more positively in terms of that degree of caring. Another way to think about trust is their trust in people's competence, how kind of core with, I think, how we think about scientists as having an area of expertise and are they good at their job. So just to walk you through that, 54% of Americans said that dietitians do a good job all or most of the time. 28% of Americans said that nutrition research scientists do a good job all or most of the time. So that's that competence level. The third judgment there is kind of trust in the integrity of information, the honesty and integrity of information. So that's giving a fair and accurate information all or most of the time. You see the same pattern across these. So we saw some variation across the 6 groups people rated. We did see that common pattern between practitioners and research scientists. We also had additional ways to look at that. People who were more familiar with each of these groups also tended to rate them more positively, essentially showing more trust in them. I'm going to say one more thing here, which is on the bottom of the slide. So, you know, there's been really decades of conversation around how much does the public trust scientists. And one of the things we wanted to do was try to explore, if there's not a high level of trust, what would be the potential sources of mistrust? So we asked people for their ratings around issues related to transparency, accountability, really scientific integrity. And what you saw there is a much more uniform picture of Americans' kind of skepticism about scientific integrity issues. Let me walk you through a couple of those. 19% of Americans said that dietitians were transparent about potential conflicts of interest all or most of the time. Similarly, 12% saying that about nutrition researchers. Another item there, how often do scientists admit and take responsibility for their mistakes? Again, a rather low share, thinking that they do so all or most of the time. And the third item in there is whether they face serious consequences when there is professional or research misconduct. So the takeaways there is really that we saw quite a bit of public skepticism around those issues of scientific integrity, and a kind of more varied look in terms of thinking about people's impressions of competence and caring or empathy for others. So yeah, so let's go ahead and move forward to just think about what kind of reactions might we have in the scientific community from that kind of public reaction on issues of scientific integrity. So we tried to ask people to tell us a little more about what they think moves their trust in scientific research findings. And here I think the data tell us a pretty clear pattern. Again, each of these rows is going to be a different question that they're asked. So we're asking people to make judgments about what moves their level of trust in scientific research. You see 57% of Americans saying that when data is openly available to the public, they find that gives them more trust in the research findings. And you see 34% saying it makes no difference to them in their level of trust. 8% say it gives them less trust. Just below that, you also see a majority of Americans saying that when they hear about research that's been reviewed by an independent committee, that lends more, that helps them give more trust in the scientific research findings, if you will. So I thought those are pretty clear takeaways. They connect with this idea of transparency. They connect with the idea of independent review as elements that tend to help increase a sense of trust. I want to be clear, we're not expecting people to actually open those data sets. They're telling us that when they hear about it being openly available, that lends to a greater sense of confidence in the findings, more trust in those findings. And then the other items there are related to the funding sources. As you know, it's kind of an ongoing piece of conversation. You do see rather negative sense of when they hear about research funded by an industry group, 58% of Americans saying that decreases their sense of trust in the findings. All right, now one more slide on trust. I want to just talk a little bit about why we spend so much time on trust in scientists, and it's not always for that big picture of trust science generally. It's often about how trust connects with people's beliefs and sometimes behaviors. So this is, again, data coming from thoughts about the coronavirus. This is in particular people's intentions to get a coronavirus vaccine from a survey taken just this February. What you want to look at here particularly are these top rows. What we're showing you is the relationship between people's levels of trust in the vaccine research and development process with their intention to get a vaccine for the coronavirus. So 96% of people who have a great deal of confidence in the R&D process either have already received at least one dose of the vaccine or intend to do so. 77% of those who have not too much or no trust in the vaccine R&D process say that they definitely or probably will not get a coronavirus vaccine. So it's a very strong pattern there. You know, it's just a reminder, I think, of many ways in which why we pay so much attention to trust in scientists. There are many different examples like this. It's just a concrete way to think about it. Okay. Let me go to the next slide, which is essentially that. Let's take a brief pause and see whether I have glossed over anything important or there's an area we want to talk about before we go on.
Thank you for that, Cary. It's so interesting to think about why these differences exist, especially in those slides where you showed the data on party affiliation and race, and think back to history and how different issues have probably influenced those groups in terms of how they feel. We have received a few questions, so I will ask just a few, maybe 2 or 3, depending on time, and then we'll go back to you. One that came in specifically related to that last slide is, do you think the genetically produced, I guess the genetically engineered COVID-19 vaccines will help ensure trust in science, or do you suspect they might have the opposite effect, even if they do succeed?
That's a really hard question. Of course, you'll probably appreciate that we try not to speculate too much about what will happen. I think there is certainly a lot of conversation around people's understanding of the method going on behind each of these different vaccines. It's unclear. I think there's so much pieces of information. It's going to be hard to disentangle, right? Because there's how they went about producing this effective vaccine. There's different conversations around whether they're effective, and then there's kind of a whole nother set of conversations around potential dangers and side effects from vaccines. So it's going to be complicated, but we're going to go into detail on how people think about biotech more generally in just a half a second.
I think that's fair. What influence do you feel like social media has had in terms of trust in science and scientists?
Again, this is a big conversation. This one is really, it's, shall we say, heating up right now, particularly. There's a couple of things to keep in mind. One thing is, you know, social media, what it does, of course, is it's allowed so many more individuals, groups to have a platform to reach so many more people so fast. It's mind-boggling how quickly a piece of information can travel around the globe through these platforms, right? So that's numero uno, right? So it has fundamentally changed how we think about the information landscape. The kind of the main areas of conversation right now have to do with the flow of misinformation, and there's kind of a distinction: misinformation, which is unclear whether the motive is intentional that usually when you think you know the motive is intentional, they call that disinformation. But it's either false or it's actually designed to be false and misleading. And so there's a lot of concern about the growth of that information, the ability of that information to spread, what we could do as a society to reduce the flow of false information, and then what the impact of it is. So I think probably if we're talking about the role of social media, I think the focus is on the potential, on the ways in which social media is allowing us to have a deeper conversation around false beliefs, I guess is one way to put it. And that's where the concern is, not so much social media itself.
Yeah, definitely a part of a much bigger conversation that I'd love to spend an hour on in addition to this. I guess one more, and we have more than we have time for in this moment, but we do have some questions specifically related to agriculture, since that's why so many people are listening today. And I'm not sure if you'll be able to answer this in the time, but we have a question about a correlation between trust in science and the food supply, specifically around genetically modified foods and best care practices for livestock. So any thoughts on that?
I think then we should just keep rolling, because yes, I have reduced our work down to food, crops, or animals as something that might possibly touch on the areas that you study and are experts in. It's probably much more simplistic than you would like, but I think it will give us some insights into what is likely to be going on where you're working. What I want to do here is just remind us about the broad range of issues we might see as connected with science. And so these are just a couple more. And particularly, I want to point out that the main takeaway we see looking across all these different kinds of issues is that we often see these divides in public opinion, but the source of those divides tends to vary. So, climate energy issues very clearly have been divided by politics for a good 20 years. That's a very strong division. That's the only area here in these pictures where we see that kind of political divide. And again, this could change, but that's the case right now. There are other areas of science where we see divisions around racial and ethnic groups. There are divisions around age, gender, education, but it's not the same depending on what we're looking at. So we're going to just go ahead and move forward and get into it. One of the so we talked about GM foods. So this is one of the things that's useful about looking at food issues when you're interested in people's views of science is that food issues, of course, connect with our everyday lives in a way that most things don't. And of course, they mostly connect through concerns around the health effects of food or the safety of food. Now, this data comes from an international survey we did, 2019, 2020. This is 20 different publics. You're seeing the first half, and the second half is coming on the next slide. And so there's a couple of things there. One thing with international surveys is you do typically need to kind of simplify the language a little bit so that you can make a comparable translation across more than 20 languages. So what we've done here is ask people for a judgment around whether each of these three different food groups was safe or unsafe to eat. One is genetically modified foods, the other is fruit and vegetables grown with pesticides, and the third is food and drinks with artificial preservatives. We do generally use genetically modified foods in our surveys at this point. Our goal is to use the most commonly understood terms. I know some people like to use genetically engineered or other kinds of terms. When that becomes the commonly used term, then we'll probably shift, but right now we see this as the most approachable term. Our big takeaway looking across these three questions, I think, is it was a bit surprising, I think, to see the degree that you're seeing a lot of people saying unsafe across these publics. The US is there near the bottom, right before you see the median. The median is the median across the 20 publics. So just focusing on the US, you see 38% of Americans said that these GM foods were unsafe to eat, 27% said they were safe. Now, if you're doing the math, you know that means something's missing here. So in this case, we did actually have a third option, which is allowing people to say they don't really know enough to say whether it's safe or unsafe. So we had a third of Americans saying they didn't know enough to say. And then you really see a pretty similar pattern. More of those who have an opinion say that produce grown with pesticides is unsafe than say it's safe. More saying that food and drink with artificial preservatives is unsafe rather than safe. We have asked about it other ways. We're gonna get to that. Go ahead and move forward. We're not going to spend a lot of time on this. Is the rest of the places we surveyed. This is Europe and Russia. Again, I think mostly the same portrait. You see a lot more on the unsafe side than the safe. Kind of interesting to see it in that context, that maybe it's not just GM foods, but a broader sense of issues connected with what we eat and the role of science and tech in that. And go ahead and move forward from there. And here I just wanted to bring up one key pattern that we often see in people's beliefs around food issues, and we see it here, is that you often see women more worried about the safety of these foods than men. So here you're seeing the share of men or women who say that each type of food is unsafe to eat, and the US is the second row there. So in the US, 46% of women said GM foods were unsafe compared with 30% of men. So that's a difference of 16 percentage points. You see a similar 19 percentage point difference when it comes to foods grown with pesticides, and 17 percentage points around artificial preservatives. Shorthanding. So this set of the 20 publics is ordered by the size of that gender difference. And so we can go ahead and go to the next slide. You'll see that it's not uniform across all 20 publics, but you see more often than not a gender difference. And we also just pointing that out because we see that a lot of times in the studies that we do in the US, that we do kind of often see these kind of gender differences. So then go ahead into the next slide. So a couple of years ago, and this was from 2018, we were looking more in depth at people's beliefs around food issues. And what really struck us was this public divide over food issues, but it's not completely clear to me, at least, what those fault lines are. So I'm going to explain these words a little bit. The first question there is the first row. We asked people, you get two choices. Do you think the average person is exposed to additives in foods which pose a serious risk to their health? And I think it had more language around over their lifetime. 51% said yes to that. Roughly half, the other half, 48%, saying that instead the average person eats such small amounts of such foods that this does not pose a serious health risk to them. That idea kind of connects with what we often hear from food chemists. People worry just about any kind of additive or product in their foods. The second row here is, you're going to see in a minute where that comes from, but roughly half of Americans said that, or exactly half of Americans said that at least one of 4 different types of food additives pose a great deal of health risk for the average person over their lifetime. And about half said that none of those 4 groups did. I'll show you those in a second. And then I just want to point out, this is a different way we've asked about people's beliefs around genetically modified foods, asking people, instead of safe or unsafe, whether or not these foods are better for health, worse for health, or neither better nor worse for one's health than non-genetically modified foods. And so in that case, you saw 49% saying that they were worse for one's health, 44% saying they are neither better nor worse. And that lines up with kind of a mirror image of how people think about organic foods, whether they see those as better for one's health or not. So the other piece of this that I think is coming up, yes, go ahead, that's fine. The piece here, what you're seeing is that there are gender differences across these beliefs around additives. People rated the degree to which these different kinds of, I guess we call them food additives for short, were posing a great deal of health risk for the average person over their lifetime. Obviously, it varies depending on how much you're going to eat. But they're rating the risk of foods grown with produce grown with pesticides, the meat from animals given antibiotics or hormones, food and drinks with artificial preservatives, and food and drinks with artificial coloring. The thing that I would point out, because in terms of the conversation around trust, is I haven't run this in terms of how it connects with people's trust in scientists, but we ran something very similar, which is people's beliefs about these kinds of additives, the health risks that they pose to people. That is directly correlated with their beliefs about whether science has generally had a positive or negative effect on the quality of food. So I take that to kind of circle back to, why do we talk about trust so much? How does it connect with people's levels of trust? And it certainly connects with people's beliefs about the role of science on what we eat. And then I think we can move forward. This is just to back it up a little bit and talk about other kinds of biotechnology. This is again from the international survey with 20 publics around the world. What I want to show here is actually one of the things that comes up a lot when we're looking at emerging science and tech is that context matters. So these are 4 different questions. The first one is asking people to rate whether scientific research on gene editing, generally speaking, is either appropriate or is misusing technology. And the US is right there at the median with 29% saying it's appropriate, with therefore the balance saying it's misusing technology. But when you go down below, when they're asked separately about different ways in which we might be using gene editing on humans, in this case on changing a baby's genetic characteristics, opinion is wildly different depending on the purpose, right? So on the first row, you're seeing that if the purpose is to treat a serious disease or condition that a baby would have at birth, the median share across these publics said that was appropriate. 66% in the US said that. Down below, slightly more unclear application. If the purpose is to reduce the risk of a serious disease that could occur over a baby's lifetime, 60% saw that as appropriate, and in the US it was around very close to that median at 57%. And then if the purpose of changing a baby's genetic characteristics was to make the baby more intelligent, very few thought of that as an appropriate use. In the US, we were also close to the median there at 17% saying such. So that's, I think, a key factor. Go ahead and go to the next slide, because we see this again when we came to issues around animal genetic engineering. They asked each of these rows is a different question. We're asking people about whether this is an appropriate use of the technology or taking it too far. And from a data perspective, you see how that lines up in this perfect stair-step manner. What we took away from this is that the context and purpose of these kinds of uses matter, of these kinds of applications of genetic engineering matter. You know, most Americans, 70%, saying that changing mosquitoes to prevent the spread of disease by limiting their reproduction would be an appropriate use of technology. Varies across the board. The least endorsed one by Americans, 21% of Americans thought changing aquarium fish to cause them to glow would be an appropriate use of technology. That is actually the only one that's commercially available, which I believe they're called glowfish. So that's one thing we took away. I'm going to show you that here in a second. Go ahead and go forward. I want to talk a little bit. We just picked out one example here so that we could talk in detail about the patterns we see in terms of public opinion. This is looking at a more divided area where you're using animals to grow organs that could be transplanted into humans. 57% Americans overall called that appropriate, 41% said not. You do see some differences there by gender again, with men more supportive than women. You see some differences by their level of science knowledge, and we can come back to that a little bit. And you see some differences by people's levels of religious commitment. So religious commitment is generally speaking, the degree of importance religion plays in your life, regardless of whether you have a particular affiliation. As usually it's as well as how often you attend religious services and how often you pray in your daily life. So that becomes the index of religious commitment. So you see that religious values can also play into these beliefs. I want to come back to science knowledge, since I think that will be of interest here. What we typically do here, we've done it a few different ways, and it has to do with asking people to answer a series of questions that have right and wrong answers. It's an index of 9 or 10 questions. Generally includes factual knowledge as well as process knowledge and numeracy. This particular scale also included some questions related to knowledge around genes and genetic modification. And you're kind of, it does tend to be correlated with education levels, but it's certainly not perfectly so. But you're seeing there that when it comes, a few of these issues when it does come to people who know more about science knowledge, more about science, you're seeing there greater acceptance of using animal genetic engineering for growing organs for human transplant relative to those who know less about science. I think one of the questions on that has to do with the causal role of science knowledge, and certainly one of the things we might discuss is that we don't see that pattern across every issue. It does tend to vary quite a bit. Go ahead and go forward. I wanted to just show you some of the open-ended comments people have around animal genetic engineering to make that point that the context matters, and what particularly matters is this sense of the human value, the value for society. The first one is about the glowfish. It's frivolous. Technology should be used to help people, animals, and the environment, not put on a glow show. Similarly, the second comment, when changing a fish to glow might sound like something people would want, but it's not beneficial to humankind. At this point, it would just be playing God to entertain rather than help us. So that's really interesting, brings up both the point of the benefit to humans as well as religious values about appropriateness of doing this kind of thing. And then the third comment here, I don't see the purpose of bringing any animal back. This would be related to animal genetic engineering for species that are about to be extinct. Would it provide a better way of life for humans? So again, using that human metric as the key point or standard against which to judge. And then we have a few more on the next slide. Just always think it's so interesting to see what people say about their reasoning of why they consider these issues to be taking technology too far. So in the first one, what you're seeing is regarding mosquitoes. By preventing their reproduction, we risk disruption of the entire ecosystem. When you mix human and non-human genetics, I believe that will cause problems down the road. Third comment, should we as human beings change the course of nature's natural selection and potentially introduce unintended serious consequences? And last here, beware of unintended consequences. The universe is in balance with them being the animals extinct. Consider the problems that man has created before by reintroducing species that have become extinct. So those are all comments. I think another very common theme that is about the worries around emerging science and tech from unintended consequences. And go ahead to this next slide. I want to step back now. This is something we've been working on for a long time. One of the things we did back in 2017 was we took the insights from 2 studies that were focused on emerging science and tech. The kind of the left-hand column, which was a series of questions focused on automation and emerging issues in automation, and the right-hand column, issues related to biomedical interventions that were all aimed at changing human abilities. So this is an area called human enhancement. And we found a couple of things that are kind of key takeaways around public opinion related to emerging science and tech. One is that very common worry over unintended consequences that came out loud and clear in focus group studies as well, that just comes up again and again as people are dealing with new ideas. The second kind of common thread that really ran through everything is this a worry, a concern about the loss of human control from these emerging technologies. And so this slide is meant to illustrate that you often see support for measures that would increase human agency or control over those technologies. So for example, regarding biomedical interventions, if we could turn those interventions on and off, if we have control over exactly how they work, then they were seen as more acceptable than not. Same thing for something like autonomous vehicles. You know, if a human is in the driver's seat to take over those controls, that was, you know, much more accepted by folks than if you didn't have that situation. So I think those are the key takeaways that I hope will be useful reminders to us as we're facing innovations in agriculture and in other studies, where the public is. And go ahead and move forward. So we're just going to take questions next to the extent we have time. I think thinking more deeply about what those kind of common reactions are to emergent science and tech will help us understand where the public concerns are focused, and then maybe how we could address those concerns as we're developing new science innovations. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Cary. That was incredible. I have so many questions for you myself, and I love that you covered everything from de-extinction to genetic engineering of humans. But turning to our audience, we did get a couple questions questions from people who noticed that women are responding differently to issues about foods being unsafe with GMOs, artificial ingredients, pesticides. Why do you think that might be?
Yeah, you know, again, this is where I wish we were in a live conversation, because I'm also interested in what you think. We do see it a lot. I'd say, right, we do see it a lot around food issues, and there is a lot of conversation about whether women are just more focused on healthy eating or more concerned, particularly around food and health issues. But then we also see some of these patterns in other kinds of biotech. We see women more resistant to the idea of gene editing, for example. And I'd say there, I really draw inspiration from some of the work by decision scientists, people like Paul Slovic and others, who told us years ago, decades ago, I think, that women on average were a little less risk acceptant relative to men. And so I'm wondering about that dimension generally, whether women are a little more hesitant to embrace some of these new technologies.
I definitely think about my experience when my kids were their youngest ages, and all my mommy groups and everyone being very concerned about who had the organic only fridge and what every child was eating. So I wonder how much that peer influence plays a role. We have a question that says the American Soybean Association recently found a great deal of public confidence in farmers and locally grown foods. And this person wants to know if you've asked about trust in farmers or attention to locally grown foods.
I saw that, and I guess we have occasionally, we did do a little bit. We have done a little bit, not a whole lot. There's a whole lot more we could do, but we did, when we were pushing on food and how people eat and what they think about organic, we definitely pushed a little bit more on whether locally grown was important. But I think the locally grown ties more into people's environmental concerns and reducing carbon footprint, and organic is the more issue connected with health concerns. And I think organic kind of popped up more in terms of that. We sometimes talked about, you know, there are definitely at least two Americas when it comes to how people eat, right? So that's why we talked about this kind of big divide. So there definitely is a large group of people who think eating organic is much healthier and kind of want to reduce all food additives, preservatives, anything they could, right? And then there are people who really don't worry about that. And then I'd say the puzzle we've been facing over the years is what else separates them? Is exactly how you get into those camps. I'm not 100% clear. We see this pattern a little bit more with men than women, women than men, but it's certainly not all women, right? It's not all men. So it's more than that. And I think we don't have as much deeper understanding as I'd like.
Have you looked at trust levels about what people say they're focused on versus whether they actually eat the foods they say they don't trust?
Oh, yes, I wanted to cover that, but I didn't get to, so thank you so much. One of the surprising things may be that what people say actually does seem to line up with what they eat, or at least to the extent you can. It's all kind of self-reported in a survey. Of course, we're not doing food diaries to actually trail around behind people to find out what they eat. But people who call themselves a more healthy eater, really focused on eating healthy, they at least tell us that the way they eat and what they avoid and what they eat pretty much does line up. So they do avoid additives and sugar and fats and all sorts of things. So that they do look very different. So that suggests to me that at least to some degree, people do pretty much eat the way they say.
Our latest wave of our food survey looked specifically at attention to food labels as one of our big focus areas. And so we saw a lot of interesting information about what people were noticing, words like natural and clean over, say, words like organic or where the food was processed, which is interesting when you think about whether or not those terms actually mean very much, or whether they're on the labels because they appeal to consumers. So it definitely gave us a lot to think about. We have a question that's not on data specifically, but I think it's an interesting one, and I'd love to hear your thoughts. This person is interested in what your ideas might be toward reaching younger generations, so students, with information as they're forming their knowledge and understanding the food chain, medicine, the kinds of issues that you've been telling us about today.
Yeah. I mean, reaching, I don't know if I can say how reaching. I mean, I think there is one other insight from the international work that we did see some patterns by age or generation, you know, just these are kind of broad cuts, older, younger. And you did see a little more acceptance among younger generations for many of these issues, the 3 food issues that I showed you with preservatives, pesticides, and GM foods, as a common pattern. So there is some question about, I guess it raises questions about whether kind of familiarity is a part of it, or whether it's education that's part of it, or whether it's a little bit of both. I think that's something to keep in mind. And reaching young people, that's kind of more of it's a little bit more of a partly a message question, but you know, there's how we reach people in schools, and then there's also how you use paid advertising or even unpaid advertising to reach people, and then of course you've got to go where people are.
We've had 2 questions just come in, and I'm going to combine them because I think it's a great area to touch on while we have you here. And that has to do with methodology. So we have a question about how the sample is drawn, how it's used in surveys, and also about the language, how the questions are worded, and whether or not that might influence how respondents answer them.
Wonderful. Yeah, I forget to tell you some of these things. So pretty much everything we do is a nationally representative survey of US adults, so across the 50 states in the district. So that's number one. Surveys have changed over the past couple of decades. And so what we do is actually an online survey, but what we're doing is drawing a representative sample and asking people, would you do this online? So you have a known probability of who you're including into the sample. That is done a couple of different ways, but one way is by sending people a letter to their homes and then having them log on and say, yes, I would participate. So we manage that survey ourselves, partly so that they don't get inundated with requests. We don't want people to be worn out and just answering surveys every day. So that's the Pew Research Center American Trends Panel. Most of the data I showed you today is probably, most of it, not all of it, Each survey is different. That's kind of customized to the different needs, but most of the US surveys we're doing are around 10,000 adults. All of the data I showed you, the standard that we would use to describe the data is probably rooted in a statistical significance test based on the size of the sample. And does question wording matter? Yes, absolutely it matters. But it's one of the reasons why I didn't want you to get too hung up on the wordings we show you on one slide or another, because over time we've asked about these things different ways. And like, as I'm sure you realize, that gives you more confidence that you kind of know how much does it shift attitudes, what are the dimensions of it, and kind of sometimes you see similar patterns and then you realize, okay, well it matters, but maybe not as much as you thought. So we're using all of that as well to kind of think about how do people come at these issues.
Great. And we are just about out of time, but before I introduce Ron, I want to ask if there's any final comments that you'd like to include about emerging trends you're seeing in science or in food specifically.
Yeah, just in general, I mean, again, that's why I hope that we'll have another conversation down the road. There's a lot we don't understand about how people see these issues. I think it connects so much with both of our work. So I hope we'll get a chance to do that.
I really do too. There's so much I want to ask you. But for now, I'll just say it was absolutely a pleasure having you join us today. I've learned a lot. I am so excited to keep talking. And I just want to say a big thank you for being here with us today. And now I have the honor of also introducing Ron Hendrick. Ron is Dean of the College of Agriculture and Natural Resources here at Michigan State University. Welcome to the conversation, Ron.
Thank you, Cheryl, and thank you, Cary, for being with us here today. You've talked about a lot of issues and perceptions on and about topics we address in some way every day in this college, and we're grateful for you sharing your insights and your expertise, and especially as you've now helped us wrap up a month-long celebration of agriculture and natural resources. During this month, we've celebrated our friends and our alumni. We spent time learning about the global experiences of our students and faculty and staff. And today we've learned a lot more about how people see us and how they see the work that we do. This month and these events we don't do because they're easy. We do them because to organize around learning and listening and relationship building is our commitment to focusing on people. I think if we can learn something from this pandemic to find the proverbial silver lining, I hope it's going to have something to do with building relationships and understanding each other. We've been given a window into our colleagues' lives this year in this virtual sense, and hopefully have used that and things like we've learned today and other events to understand each other a little bit better. Over the past year, I think every one of us has struggled in some way, and no one particularly greater than the other, but this has all been hard, and our world has changed a lot, and it's going to continue to change. And so I think we can take the things we've learned over this past month, the celebrations we've had, use what we've learned to help define our new normal over these next few years, and continue to base the practices we do on keeping people in focus and make lasting change that we started. So I really appreciate today's conversation. I look forward to more of those and more opportunities to interact both virtually and in person. Thanks again, everyone, for joining us today. Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Cary.